How does a man once lionized as the desert fox end up accused, in Hitler's eyes and in the eyes of many contemporaries, of betraying the Führer he once served? That is the question that follows Erwin Rommel from the dunes of North Africa to the hedgerows of Western Europe, and it is the question that shaped the final months of his life. The answer is not a single act of treachery, nor a neat moral conversion. It is a chain of professional judgments, political awakenings, and private choices, made under the pressure of a collapsing state. To understand why Rommel moved from celebrated field marshal to a figure shadowed by the word betrayal, we must follow him through the victories that built his reputation, the failures that revealed the regime's limits, and the moral shocks that altered his priorities. Erwin Rommel was born into the German officer class and made his name, the old way, in war. He arrived in World War I as a junior officer and left as an experienced, decorated leader, one of a generation of soldiers shaped by the mud and mechanical slaughter of modern war. Between the wars, he remained a professional in the Reichswehr, the army that guarded its traditions above politics. When the Third Reich remilitarized Germany and swept to power, Rommel did not join the party's inner circles. He advanced because of competence and because his reputation suited a leadership eager for hero figures. In the campaign of 1940, his skillful handling of armored units in France earned widespread attention. Promoted and photographed, Rommel began to stand out not for ideology but for results. Those results produced a public image that extended beyond the battlefield. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine singled him out. A modern warrior, audacious and fresh-faced, someone who could be presented as proof that Germany's armed forces were glorious and invincible. In newsreels and posters, Rommel became more than a commander. He became a symbol. For many Germans, he was the soldier who embodied honor, daring, and professional mastery. For Rommel himself, the adulation was ambivalent. He remained, throughout, a soldier first, focused on logistics, terrain, and the morale of his men. Yet the image the regime projected onto him would later complicate his options. A decorated and popular general is harder for a dictatorship to discard quietly, and harder for the man himself to ignore when politics intruded. In October 1941, Rommel arrived in North Africa to command the newly formed Afrika Korps, and there his tactical gifts found a stage. Against a theater that was as much desert and supply line as it was enemy force, Rommel practiced a particular blend of speed, improvisation, and risk-taking. He exploited gaps, harried enemy flanks, and used limited resources to punch above expectation. His operations around Tobruk, his counterattacks against larger British formations, and his capacity to keep a precarious front moving created the legend of the Desert Fox. Within months, the press and the public had frozen an image of him as the undefeated, resourceful commander who outfoxed numerically superior foes. But the desert's success hid structural weaknesses. North Africa was, from the start, a campaign fought on borrowed time and precarious logistics. Axis supply convoys crossed the Mediterranean under Allied interdiction. Fuel and ammunition were chronic scarcities. For every tactical triumph Rommel achieved, there was a logistical account sitting unread in Berlin that could not be ignored for long. The Wehrmacht's strategic priorities lay elsewhere, on the Eastern Front, then on Hitler's insistence that important industrial and political objectives be held at almost any cost. Rommel's pleas for reinforcements and for a realistic assessment of the theater's needs ran into higher political choices. Hitler's strategic attention was limited and his directives increasingly rigid. The radio silence from the leadership on resource allocation was not a mere military inconvenience. It was the first crack in a relationship that depended on mutual understanding of ends and means. The tension between professional soldier and political commander deepened as the war's balance shifted. The cataclysm at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942-43 was more than a military catastrophe. It was evidence that the regime's strategic vision had exhausted itself. The surrender of the Sixth Army exposed how disastrously Hitler's absolute orders could translate into wholesale ruin. For many officers who had once trusted the strategic direction from Berlin, the consequences were personal and disorienting. Rommel watched events on the Eastern Front with the same professional eye he used to appraise terrain. The resources thrown away, the refusal to withdraw when prudent, the catastrophic cost in men and material. He began to speak privately with a bluntness that surprised those who had known him only through the sanitized voice of propaganda. To Rommel, the idea of continuing a war on two fronts until Germany was ground down by attrition was not merely unwise, it was suicidal for the nation he believed he had sworn to protect. At the same time, another, darker realization began to prick at the conscience of officers who were not party functionaries. Reports and rumors of SS brutality, of mass shootings and deportations filtered through military lines. The Wehrmacht and the SS were not neatly separate for many Germans. Frontline officers saw with their own eyes the machinery of occupation and repression, and they faced moral choices about how far obedience could extend when that obedience met systematic criminality. What Rommel did and did not know about the full scale of the Holocaust remains a subject historians debate. The evidentiary record is not definitive. Yet, even if he lacked complete knowledge of the extermination camp's mechanics, Rommel's correspondence and the accounts of contemporaries indicate that he was troubled by what he learned. For a professional soldier who prized honor and the rules of conventional warfare, there was a growing dissonance between his oath to the state and the state's criminal actions. These strategic and moral tensions followed Rommel back to Europe. In late 1943 and into 1944, he was given responsibility for the defense of the Western approaches. The task was monumental: to prepare the Atlantic Wall against the threat everyone in the German High Command expected, the Allied cross-channel invasion. Rommel toured the coastlines, inspected beaches and bluffs, and argued for a simple, though demanding, idea: stop the enemy at the shore. He believed that once Allied infantry and armor established a beachhead, naval and air superiority would make German counterattacks lethal and costly. The spirit of his defensive doctrine favored denial of landing space, fortified positions close to the waterline, and placement of mobile reserves for rapid counterstrikes. That approach clashed with other officers who favored depth and counterattack once beachheads formed, and it raised a difficult practical problem. Fortifying every mile of coast required men, concrete, and equipment that the Reich could no longer spare. Rommel's solutions were blunt and direct. He ordered local work, improvisation, and the mobilization of labor where he could find it. He prioritized obstacles on beaches, mines, and the placement of anti-tank guns. He also tried to make the case at the highest level that the Western Front required a shift in strategic outlook. Here the old tension returned. Hitler's micromanagement and refusal to allot the kind of strategic flexibility Rommel sought deepened the commander's frustration. From Rommel's perspective, the regime's priorities and military reality increasingly diverged. By early 1944, two images became intertwined in Rommel's thinking. One was the tactical map, a coastline dotted with fortifications that, if manned and supplied, might blunt an invasion. The other was the larger strategic ledger, a Germany battered in the east, bleeding in Russia, and unable to sustain long-term victory. The intersection of these images produced a cold professional assessment. Even with the best defensive preparations, Germany's situation was deteriorating beyond recovery. With Allied control of the air and sea, the industrial capacity of the United States and Britain, and the Soviet juggernaut in the East, Rommel concluded that a purely military defense might only prolong destruction rather than secure any enduring outcome for Germany. That assessment moved Rommel beyond private pessimism. In conversations with colleagues and in letters, he made clear his belief that Germany's future required a political solution, not simply better fortifications. He urged measured, pragmatic options. Negotiate terms to prevent the total ruin of the nation, and consider political realignments that could spare Germany occupation and annihilation. For a man raised in the tradition of the officer's duty to state above all, this was not a small step. Betrayal, in the language of Berlin and in the view of hardline supporters of Hitler, is the moment when a commander turns from executing orders to seeking to remove the leader's authority. For Rommel, however, the sequence was not born of personal ambition, but of a conviction that the military and the nation were headed toward catastrophe, one that could be averted only through political accommodation. Rommel's warnings culminated in a written appeal. In the months before the invasion, he drafted a forceful, succinct letter addressed to Hitler, one that would later be described as roughly 3 pages in length. In it, he pleaded for a change of course, to explore negotiation, to consider the political implications of continued resistance, and, in some formulations, to contemplate the removal of Hitler from power if it could prevent Germany's annihilation. He did not, in that letter, endorse assassination. Rommel's stance on violence against the head of state was clear in his own moral calculus. To kill the Führer was, for him, an act without honor. What he did advocate, according to the text and the testimony that survives, was political displacement through lawful or at least non-murderous mechanisms, if that were possible. Whether Hitler would ever accept such counsel was another matter. The letter closed on a grim recognition. Military means alone would not be enough. The surrendering of pride and the willingness to sacrifice the myth of invincibility might be necessary to save what remained of Germany. If the letter marked the clearest crystallization of Rommel's break from Hitler's strategy, it also set a new danger in motion. By advocating negotiation and by speaking to colleagues who shared his concerns, Rommel placed himself in a perilous gray zone. He was neither a leader of assassination nor a passive loyalist. He was a high-profile figure whose suggestions undermined the Führer's absolute narrative. In a regime where loyalty was measured not only by deeds but by the appearance of unwavering support, a public call for negotiation could be read as treason. For Rommel, who had been the regime's chosen hero in so many wartime vignettes, the shift risked more than censure. It invited retribution. Even as Rommel pushed for political realism, the military situation along the Channel already worried him. Allied preparations for invasion were growing more conspicuous. Increased shipping, air activity, and, far more damaging to German planning, an elaborate deception campaign. Allied intelligence and deception efforts, including fake armies and misleading radio traffic, convinced German planners that an invasion might come where defenses were weakest. Rommel suspected the Allies would seek a landing at a location where deep defenses were thin, and he worried that German leadership's compartmentalized command would delay the concentration of reserves in time to repel landings. He saw the coming clash as a test not only of bunkers and mines, but of political will and strategic prudence. Behind the scenes, a broader network of officers and civilian conservatives who had grown disenchanted with Hitler's leadership circulated plans and proposals. Some favored arrest, others preferred a legal transfer of power, and a few contemplated assassination. Rommel's position among these men was ambiguous. He sympathized with the goal of removing Hitler to save Germany, but retained personal revulsion at the idea of murder. Some conspirators believed Rommel could lend legitimacy to their actions simply through his agreement or moral support. His name carried weight among troops and civilians alike. For conspirators who feared the consequences of outright violence, Rommel's preference for non-murderous displacement was attractive. For Hitler and his inner circle, any contact with opposition figures, even if limited to advocating negotiation, was tantamount to betrayal. It is here, in this accumulation of professional judgment, moral revulsion, and political calculation, that the case for betrayal takes shape, but not in the neat binary the word suggests. Rommel's movement away from complete loyalty to Hitler was first and foremost a strategic realism. He judged the war unwinnable and wanted to mitigate Germany's destruction. It was also a form of patriotism, defined by a desire to preserve the state and its people, even if that meant opposing the man who had led them to ruin. And threaded through both motives was a moral discomfort with the regime's crimes. Even if Rommel did not have full knowledge of the Holocaust's machinery, the violence and repression he witnessed contributed to his growing alienation. Yet motives do not erase consequence.
For Hitler and for the propaganda apparatus that had elevated Rommel, any suggestion of negotiation or political exit was treasonous. The very fame that had protected Rommel in quieter years now made his dissent dangerous. He was too visible to be ignored and too popular to be prosecuted without blowback. So the question remained, would his professional warnings and private entreaties be enough to change policy, or would they instead mark him, in the regime's eyes, as a man who had stepped over the line? If any of Rommel's contemporaries expected a slow, orderly transition from counsel to policy, they were mistaken. The clock he and others watched was moving toward a confrontation they could not control. From his vantage point on the Atlantic coast, Rommel believed that when the invasion came, the fate of Germany would be decided not only on seashores and hedgerows, but by whether the leadership accepted the need to negotiate before the nation was utterly consumed.
He wrote, he argued, he tried to persuade. Those acts can be framed as patriotism, as pragmatic realism, or, by those still loyal to Hitler's absolute power, as betrayal. Historians continue to argue about where personal conviction ends and political treachery begins. Contemporary accounts indicate that Rommel did not wish to be seen as a conspirator in the sense of plotting murder. Yet he was willing to see Hitler removed from power by other means if it would spare Germany ruin. That subtle distinction mattered in the calculus of men who ruled through terror and spectacle. A soldier who counseled negotiation was a greater threat than a nameless clerk who signed an execution order, because the soldier could sway public opinion. The storm gathering over Rommel intensified as measures of the Allied buildup made invasion not a distant threat but an imminent reality. Air superiority, shipping convoys, and the growing numbers of assault troops signaled a scale of operation Germany had not yet faced in the West. Rommel's defensive plan, concentrated, tough coastal defenses augmented by mobile reserves, depended on the freedom to move forces under conditions of uncertain command. Yet, as ever, Hitler's command style and the fragmented chain of authority in occupied France complicated decisive responses. Rommel, who had spent years thinking in operational terms, began to connect tactics and politics in a new way. Military defeat would produce political collapse, and political collapse would intensify the criminality and destruction he had already witnessed. If the Führer clung to power to the bitter end, Germany would not merely lose a war, it would be devastated as a nation and a people. For a man whose identity was bound to preserving the army and the state, that possibility became intolerable. So he drafted his letter, he conferred with trusted colleagues, and he edged into a sphere where the difference between counsel and conspiracy was a matter of interpretation. In private circles, he expressed a willingness to support the removal of Hitler by legal or political means if such a removal could prevent wholesale ruin. He refused to endorse assassination on principle. Yet those distinctions would not save him if the regime chose to punish dissent by example. The stage, then, was set for a collision between Rommel's reasoned pragmatism and a dictatorship that measured loyalty by absolute submission. What began as a soldier's insistence on realistic military policy had matured into a deeper judgment about the fate of Germany. Whether one calls that judgment betrayal depends on how one defines the oath to a leader versus the duty to a nation. For Rommel, the obligation to the nation and to the lives of its people was beginning to outweigh unquestioning obedience to a man whose decisions, in his view, now endangered both. When the invasion finally came, the question of whether his warnings had been heeded would be answered on the beaches of Normandy.
But before those beaches were stormed, Rommel stood at a crossroads, the public face of the regime's military honor, privately pleading for a political course correction that the Führer would never willingly accept. In the weeks that followed the delivery of his letter, the contours of his choices would harden into actions that some would call pragmatic and others treacherous. The consequences of stepping into that gray zone between soldierly duty and political intervention were about to become painfully clear. If you like deep dives into the turning points of history, subscribe for more. This one deserves a full close look. When the Allied Armada struck Normandy on June 6, 1944, the scene that unfolded on the beaches and in the hedgerows quickly answered a stubborn question. The age of mobile, combined arms war had met the vast industrial power of the Anglo-American alliance. For Erwin Rommel, the invasion was not merely a military setback to be repaired by better tactics. It confirmed a larger, bleaker calculation he had been making for months. The beach defenses he had insisted on could slow attackers, he believed, but without room to maneuver, air superiority and overwhelming reserves would grind down any German response. The D-Day landings exposed the strategic arithmetic he had already feared. Germany lacked the depth and material reserves to turn tactical resistance into durable victory. Where that realization led Rommel was less a pivot into treachery than a final, desperate attempt to spare his country a ruin he judged avoidable. Rommel's absence at the immediate moment of invasion is part of the story that has provoked confusion and controversy. In early June, he had been traveling in Germany, inspecting units, attempting to secure resources, and dealing with family matters. Some commanders judged his absence unlucky. His defenders said that the system of command in France produced delays regardless. What matters for understanding his turning point is not a single missed order, but the accumulation of his assessments in the hours and days after the landings. Reports from the front, intelligence assessments, and the steady stream of casualties convinced him that the built defensive line would be breached, and that, once that happened, the prospects for meaningful counteraction were grim. The invasion hardened Rommel's argument for a political solution. He had prepared a blunt, professional calculus long before D-Day. Prolonging combat would not preserve Germany. It would destroy it. His military solution, hard, stubborn coastal denial, depended on forces and mobility the Reich no longer had. Politically, he saw only two choices: continue a ruinous fight to the end, or seek terms that might limit occupation and protect what remained of the country. That judgment propelled him toward the dangerous, gray edge between counsel and conspiracy. The three-page plea attributed to him, whether drafted in the weeks before the landings or finalized in their immediate aftermath, encapsulated his reasoning. In it, he warned of national annihilation if Germany continued on the existing course, and urged negotiation as the sober alternative. He framed the question as one of duty, the responsibility of commanders to prevent the needless loss of life and the collapse of institutions. Explicitly, he did not call for assassination. Rommel's moral framework, forged in the traditions of the officer corps, repudiated murder as a tool of political change. He believed that removing Hitler by nonviolent means, through arrest, forced abdication, or legal mechanisms, was both more honorable and, crucially, more likely to secure a negotiated exit. Whether that stance was realistic or idealistic is a matter historians debate. What is clear is that the letter positioned Rommel directly against Hitler's ideological intransigence. At the same time, Rommel's contacts with civilian conservatives and military officers who wanted to see the leadership changed grew more frequent. Figures around the Kreisau Circle and officers tied to the conspiratorial networks valued his name as a moderating, legitimizing force. To them, Rommel's endorsement of non-lethal means to displace Hitler could provide the veneer of continuity and order that might persuade the army and the populace to accept a new government. To Hitler's inner circle, however, any engagement with opponents was tantamount to revolt. In a regime built on charismatic loyalty, the appearance of the field marshal's sympathy for removing the Führer was intolerable. Then came a proximate blow that intensified the peril Rommel faced: the car attack of July 17, 1944. The details of that incident have long been contested. On that day, Rommel was traveling near the front when his staff car came under strafing from an Allied fighter bomber. The general suffered severe head and shoulder injuries and was evacuated to a hospital in Germany. Some contemporaries and later chroniclers have entertained darker theories, suggesting the attack might not have been purely incidental or that the regime could have exploited the incident for political ends.
The clearest fact is this: the injuries rendered Rommel vulnerable. He was physically incapacitated at a moment when suspicion began to coalesce around any senior officer who had expressed doubts about Hitler's leadership. 3 days later, on July 20, the assassination attempt led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg detonated under Hitler's nose. The bomb failed to kill the Führer, and the conspirators' bid to seize control collapsed under the regime's swift countermeasures. The immediate aftermath was a purge of unprecedented ferocity. Arrests, public trials, and executions rippled through Germany's military and civilian elite.
In the brutal logic of that response, anyone who had entertained the idea of removing Hitler, even by lawful or non-murderous means, fell under suspicion. Rommel's position between council and conspiracy now mattered in the worst way. He had not taken part in the bombing. He had, by most accounts, remained opposed to assassination. Yet his private conversations, his 3-page appeal, and his contacts with officers who were part of the wider resistance net made him a likely target. The regime sought not merely guilty conspirators, but public exemplars, heroes destroyed as a warning. Rommel's public stature made him a prize. He was too prominent either to be quietly punished without raising questions or to be fully protected by his prior fame. The mechanics of how Rommel became officially implicated are both personal and bureaucratic. Interrogations, denunciations, and the plain need to demonstrate the regime's impotence toward dissent converged. Gestapo investigations turned up notes, testimonies, and linkages. Names of officers who had spoken with Rommel, some of them involved in conspiratorial planning, surfaced in extreme detail. Historians differ on the precise weight these contacts carried. Some contemporaries argue that Rommel's involvement was marginal. A man who had counseled negotiation rather than murder and who had not taken operational steps to support the coup. Others insist that in the calculus of the regime, the difference between offering moral sanction and active participation was irrelevant. What followed for Rommel was a cruel bargaining of life, honor, and family security. Instead of a public trial that would have exposed high-level dissent and perhaps implicated others, the Nazi leadership offered him a grim choice. Presented by emissaries of the regime, men who represented both the legal power of the state and the ruthlessness of its security apparatus, Rommel was told that accepting his culpability and taking his own life would spare his family from arrest and ensure a state-sanctioned funeral. Refusal, by contrast, would lead to a public spectacle, an open trial, probable conviction for treason, and harsh reprisals against his wife and son. For a military man devoted to the welfare of his household and the honor of his uniform, the decision was personal, immediate, and devastating. On October 14, 1944, Erwin Rommel died by cyanide. The circumstances read now like a tragic coda to a life of soldiering. In accepting death on terms dictated by his enemies, he saved his family from direct retribution and secured for himself the appearance of dignity, a military funeral, the trappings of honor. To the men who pushed the regime to its end, Rommel's death was a complex symbol of compromise, of the limited ways dissent could manifest inside a totalitarian machine, and of the human calculus that men in positions of authority sometimes must perform when the law of survival and the law of conscience collide.
Assessing the gravity of his betrayal requires parsing what was at stake for the different actors who used that word. For Hitler and his true believers, betrayal meant the abandonment of loyalty to a leader whose authority was personal and absolute. For conspirators and many officers who saw the regime's policies as suicidal, Rommel's willingness to support non-murderous removal of Hitler and his publicly voiced doubts looked like a necessary intervention to save the nation. For neutral observers then and later, the label of betrayal is politically freighted. It carries the voice of those who equate loyalty to the Führer with loyalty to Germany. Rommel's movement away from that equation was, in the regime's eyes, treason. In his own mind, it was an exercise of duty to the state and to the men he commanded. Historians continue to debate the contours of Rommel's moral and political positioning. On the question of his knowledge of Nazi atrocities, the evidence remains ambivalent. There is no conclusive document proving that Rommel possessed full operational knowledge of extermination camps.
At the same time, multiple accounts and fragmentary reports indicate he was aware of the brutality of occupation and the operations of SS units in the East and in occupied territories. Some of those reports reached him as rumors, others as first-hand descriptions from officers returning from the front. How he reconciled such information with his oath and professional identity is part of the tragic ambivalence of his story. A soldier steeped in traditional military codes confronted by a regime whose criminality transcended conventional warfare. Another contested element is the degree and nature of his involvement with the July 20 plotters. There is no convincing evidence that he participated in their operational planning. Indeed, his moral repudiation of assassination suggests he would have balked at Stauffenberg's method. Yet Rommel's sympathies for removing Hitler by legal or forced abdication placed him in an ambiguous moral and political position. Some conspirators sought his tacit approval to lend legitimacy to their project, while others believed his reputation could sway the army and civilian elites. After the failed bomb attempt, that very ambiguity was read by Hitler's security apparatus as complicity. The memory of Rommel after the war further complicates the picture. Western narratives, especially in Britain and the United States during the early Cold War, embraced a version of Rommel that emphasized professional chivalry and tactical brilliance. He became the archetype of the honorable foe, the field marshal who fought well and was not tainted by ideology. This image was convenient for allies who wanted to distinguish between German soldiers and the criminal Nazi leadership.
In Germany, Rommel's legend was invoked by those who sought national rehabilitation and a figure around whom to rebuild pride without confronting the depth of the regime's crimes. The result was a post-war Rommel that was both a historical man and a malleable symbol. Rejecting both hagiography and pure condemnation, recent scholarship has pushed toward nuance. Rommel was a brilliant tactician who owed much of his fame to his operational successes and to the propaganda that made him a public face. He was not an ardent ideologue. He was not a Nazi in the mold of Himmler or Goebbels, but neither was he a dissident who refused to serve a criminal regime from the start. He benefited from his proximity to power. He accepted honors, and, in several instances, he profited from the structures and spoils of a state committing crimes. At the same time, the record shows a man whose professional commitments evolved into political judgments as the war's realities became undeniable. Was Rommel therefore a traitor? The answer, within historical terms, must be contextual. Traitor in whose eyes? To Hitler and his apparatus, yes. His advocacy of negotiation and his openness to removing the Führer were betrayals of absolute loyalty. To many of his contemporaries, who judged by the metric of national survival rather than personal loyalty, his actions were those of a practical patriot trying to avert catastrophe. To posterity, Rommel's final choices illustrate the moral constriction in which German elites operated. A shrinking set of options where resistance took forms that were partial, compromised, and often entangled with personal survival. One of the most poignant tests of any historical judgment is how we account for motive. Three threads run through Rommel's motives: professional realism, patriotism, and moral revulsion. Professional realism is visible in every operational assessment he made from North Africa to the Atlantic Wall. He was a soldier who measured outcomes in men and material and who recognized limits when they appeared. Patriotism is visible in his insistence that any action be oriented toward preserving the state and its people. His plea for negotiation was cast as an act to save Germany. Moral revulsion, finally, is visible in his growing unease with the methods and agents of Nazi rule. An unease that may never be fully evidenced in a single document, but is threaded through his private correspondence and the testimony of those who knew him. There is one final human element in his story: the weight of the officer's oath and the protective instinct toward family. Faced with the choice imposed by Hitler's emissaries, an ignominious public trial that would endanger his wife and son, or a private death that preserved them, Rommel chose the latter. That decision was not proof of cowardice or of moral clarity.
It was a calculus of responsibility in a world where legal protections had collapsed and the security state wielded the last decisive power.
The man who once led rapid thrusts through desert sands accepted a sovereign's lethal bargaining chip because he judged it the lesser of two moral harms. Rommel's legacy is therefore not a simple moral epitaph. He is remembered by some as a tragic realist who turned against ruin, by others as a compromised servant of a criminal system who sought to preserve status and honor to the end. The evidence does not support a single, tidy verdict. What it does show is a man whose tactical genius coexisted with a political and moral evolution that pushed him to contemplate extraordinary measures. His betrayal was not an act of passion or betrayal for reward. It was the consequence of accumulated professional assessments, private moral revulsion, and a patriotic impulse to avert national catastrophe. In a regime where dissent was criminalized and political alternatives were lethal, the distinction between counsel and conspiracy blurred, and a soldier's attempt to alter policy became, in the eyes of the regime, treason. The story of Rommel's final months forces a larger question upon us. How should history judge actors who operate within criminal systems, but who also resist, in limited and compromised ways, the worst of those systems? The answer cannot be simple. It requires us to weigh acts against context, motives against consequences, and public image against private conviction. Rommel's life supplies a study in such complexities. Tactical brilliance that made him a propaganda hero, a growing strategic pessimism that made him a critic, private contacts and public counsel that made him suspect, and a death arranged by the regime he once served. In the end, the title's stark formulation, "Why did Rommel betray Hitler?" demands a nuanced answer. If betrayal is defined as the abandonment of personal loyalty to a leader, then yes. To Hitler and to the myth of unyielding loyalty, Rommel betrayed the Führer. But if betrayal is judged by the metric of service to the nation, to the army, and to the lives under his charge, then Rommel's action can be read as an attempt to fulfill a higher duty, preventing annihilation. Seen this way, his betrayal is less a moral collapse than a tragic reordering of loyalties in the face of a collapsing regime. Rommel's story resists simple moral closure. It remains instead a reminder of the agonies of conscience that war and dictatorship create. He was a man whose military mind could not reconcile itself with a political system that squandered lives and embraced criminality, and whose means of resisting were inevitably shaped and limited by the very power he had once served. History may never fully answer every question about his knowledge, his motives, or the full extent of his contacts with conspirators.
What it can conclude, with reasonable humility, is that his move away from Hitler was motivated by professional realism, patriotic concern, and moral revulsion, an uneasy combination that led some contemporaries to call him a traitor and others to call him a tragic realist. For those who study the period, Rommel's life is a case study in the moral dilemmas faced by professional military leaders under authoritarian rule. It shows how public image can both protect and imperil, how honor codes can collide with criminal policies, and how the path from loyalty to dissent is often paved by pragmatic, not merely ideological judgments. If you want to explore one of the closest things to a direct counterpoint to Rommel's story, the full arc of the July 20 plot and the network of officers who risked everything to attempt regime change, watch our deep dive on that conspiratorial movement next. The events of that summer of 1944 are intertwined, and understanding them together helps explain why a figure like Rommel could be viewed as both traitor and patriot, enemy and tragic hero.